So the American Psychiatric Association defines trauma this way. They say it is the exposure to either actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual or other violence. They go on to say that these can result from personal assaults as the effects of war, or even exposure to ongoing community environment issues, right? So trauma is something that impacts not only the person directly affected, but oftentimes those around them, those who are exposed to the traumatic occurrences. And so as a result, it's estimated roughly that somewhere around 70% of American adults have experienced at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. And I can tell you, after doing ministry for 20 plus years and being up close in the lives of people, walking with them through all of the things that life throws our way, that number feels low to me. The trauma seems to be something we all have some unfortunate encounters with. And as you might expect, trauma has a way of staying with us, right? It doesn't simply go away easily. Now, many of the smaller scale traumas that we endure in life are things that may pass quickly from our experience, but other, particularly significant traumatic moments, they have a way of hanging around. They have a way of beginning to impact not only our life, but the way in which we see the world around us. Right? Maybe you've experienced something similar to this. Like you kind of have that anxious feeling and your heart starts to race as you near the intersection where you had that bad car accident. And you go through there all the time, and it only happened the once. But every time, that trauma comes to the surface. Maybe you find yourself dealing with the emotional drain, the anxiety, the depression that comes as you near the anniversary of a loved one's death. You start to mourn them all over again. We've been having this conversation now about scars for a few weeks. We've been talking about our scars, about heartbreak, flesh wounds, and other things that leave a mark. And if you're just joining us today, you're kind of coming in at the tail end of a conversation. But one thing that we've seen consistently, week in and week out, as we've been exploring this idea together, is this big idea. It's in the teaching notes. If you use the YouVersion Bible app, you can find all the stuff on the screen will be in the events tab. Down at the bottom, you can just click there and you can jot some things down, take some notes if that's helpful. But the big idea we keep coming back to in this conversation goes like this. Scars mark our present reality by our past experience. The body can heal, but it doesn't easily forget. Right? Scars are those things. They mark our present experience, the way things are for us now, by our past experience, the things that have happened to us then. And they do that because our bodies, our minds, our hearts, our souls can heal, but they don't easily forget. And so we carry these things with us. And so in this conversation, we've been saying we don't just simply want to acknowledge that trauma is real. We don't simply want to acknowledge that our scars have this propensity for sticking around and following us wherever we go. We want to explore the way that God longs to bring us healing and transform the stories that our scars can tell. Right? Because the most important thing we can come to is not that our scars go away, but that the story those scars tell is transformed by the grace of God. And so what does that mean, right? Let's dig into that a little bit today, because we not only need to figure out what it means, we also need to spend a few minutes talking about what it doesn't mean, okay? The lived experience of the modern church has, I believe, far too often tries to distance ourselves from these kinds of topics, particularly from the clinical side of things like trauma and mental health, emotional well-being, right? And so too often we get into this headspace as followers of Jesus where we think we have to pit our faith and our mental health against one another as if those things are mutually exclusive, that they're just two different critters, right? We sometimes seem to fall into this idea that we can, if we could just get people to believe the right things, to pray hard enough, that all the scars, all the trauma, all the mental and emotional weights that we carry just go away. But here's what I want you to hear me say, church. Pursuing the ways and words of Jesus and pursuing our mental and emotional health should not be mutually exclusive, right? They can cross over. And unfortunately, sometimes we don't talk about them as if they can. I don't know what they got going on down there, but man, they are wound. That's all right. That's all right. It's life. We will take that. See, as a follower of Jesus, I want you to understand you don't need to choose between trusting Jesus or seeking the help of a clinical expert, right? We can trust Jesus to work through a mental health expert the same way you trust Jesus to work through your cancer doctor or through the orthopedic surgeon that puts your knee back together after that backyard basketball game when you forgot you weren't 24 anymore. Right? Like, we do this all the time when it comes to our physical health, but somehow within the church, when we begin to talk about the unseeable and invisible scars we carry, we just kind of separate it out and say it's something different. Okay, so we need to make sure we understand what we're not talking about. That just the way that you take your faith and your pursuit of the ways and words of Jesus into your doctor's office with you, you can carry your faith and the pursuit of the ways and words of Jesus into dealing with the unseeable scars that life's traumas have left on your heart, on your mind, and on your soul. And at its core, that is the work of the church. That is the work of the good news of Jesus in us that we're after when we talk about allowing God to heal what hurts us. That when we're asking God to rewrite the stories that our scars have to tell. One of the ways that our past experiences tends to mark our present reality with unseen scars is through fear. When we experience difficult or traumatic things, right, there's this response that kicks in our brain chemistry called fight or flight. You guys have heard about this, right? Like, it's when you're in danger, all of a sudden, your brain goes into danger mode. Okay? And so when that happens, a couple of things take place. The fear center of your brain and the memory center of your brain go into overdrive. Right? I'm not a brain expert. I don't pretend to be. But I think this stuff is fascinating, right? The Lord has created and wired our physical bodies in a way that allows us to respond to these things. And so when we find ourselves in frightening, difficult moments, the fear center and the memory center of our brains kick in, preparing us for action, but also making sure we remember going forward how we got into danger. Right? The most basic level of this is the whole, like, touch a hot stove, pull your hand back, you don't touch hot stoves anymore, right? It's a memory thing. Your brain is wired to go, yeah, don't do that last time it hurt. Right? The same principle applies when we're dealing with other sorts of trauma, okay? So that when we face fear, these things kick in our brain. But just as much as we sometimes distance ourselves from talking about mental health and those kinds of things alongside faith, we also aren't always sure we want to talk about fear in light of our faith, right? And so we almost kind of pit them against one another as if faith and fear are opposite things. But in reality, faith is simply a response to fear. Faith doesn't take the scary stuff away. But it does allow us to stand firm in the truth of who God is and what He is like, no matter the circumstances we face. And so usually when we look into the pages of Scripture, we tend to focus on the faith of the people we meet there. And we go, oh, they just had such tremendous faith. And when we do that, sometimes we forget that the faith that they display is held up against a backdrop of frightening and dangerous moments in their lives, moments that they probably wish they didn't have to face. The very moments that we look to and applaud and go, oh, wow, they are just so faithful, are the moments that in real time they're going, Lord, why am I in this spot? What did I do to deserve this, right? Okay? And so we oftentimes forget that the faith that we kind of laud and prop up is often playing out in a world that is riddled with fear, that is riddled with danger, a world that is riddled with the sort of trauma that can leave us with scars. That was the case for the people of God collectively, and certainly the case individually for 4 young men when God's people were taken into exile. These men were carried off from their homes. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, along with their friend Daniel, whose name is on the book in which we find their story, understood what it was to live in a world riddled with fear, riddled with dangers, riddled with the sort of trauma that could very easily leave them scarred. So let's take a look at their experience. I invite you to turn with me this morning to Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1. We're going to cover a lot of ground in the text today and try to move quickly as we do so. But we want to begin in Daniel chapter 1, verse number 1. It was in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles of the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language, the literature of the Babylonians, and the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they were trained for 3 years. And after that, they were to come into the king's service. And among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. So the events that lead us up to this moment involve the exile of Judah, the people of God, to Babylon. And no doubt they were moments filled with trauma for everyone involved. The moments that lead us up to this opening of Daniel's prophecy are moments that include a lengthy military siege which in the ancient world was about the worst possible way for a city to fall. It's much better to lose on the battlefield if you're back at home than it is for your city to be sieged, because it is a long, drawn-out, miserable affair while the advancing foreign army simply tries to starve you out. So there's a lengthy military siege. There's an invasion of hostile foreign troops. And ultimately, the city of Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, is sacked by the Babylonian invaders, and the temple of God itself is looted and destroyed. These moments of the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, they would mark generations of God's people. Those who experienced it and those who were exposed to the aftermath would be marked with scars and trauma from the events that led up to this moment. Daniel and his friends no doubt experienced the fear of warfare, living in a war zone, only to then be uprooted from their homes, from their families, taken miles and miles away, given new names, and forced to serve in the court of the Babylonian king who was their captor. Now, I think sometimes we encounter these moments in Scripture and we kind of know the story or we've heard the story, and so we're like, oh yeah, all that stuff happened. And we forget that these are real people living in the real world who had all of those things happen to them in the course of a couple of years of life. By our best estimate, Daniel and presumably his friends experienced these things when they are about 15 years old. These aren't grizzled war veterans. They're kids. And they're shuttled off far from home, given new names. And right away, their faith begins to be tested. Because the king's steward is instructed to give them food from the king's table. So what we can know about that is a couple of things. One, the food from the king's table had no doubt been offered on the altar to a Babylonian god. A big no-no under the Jewish law for them to eat this food. Chances are some, if not most, of the food they were being offered was not considered ceremonially clean under the Old Testament law. Again, another big no-no for them to eat this food. And so Daniel proposes a challenge. We don't want to eat the king's food and defile ourselves. And so how about this? You just give us vegetables, just vegetables from the garden, and we'll eat just that, and in a few weeks we'll test it out. And if we are worse off than all the other people who are in the program here at Babylonian University, then you know what? We'll eat the king's food. And so the test unfolds, and Daniel and his friends actually come through this challenge ahead above all the other captives and other people in training in this school for people for the Babylonian court. And so they are given prime positions in the king's service, which probably means they're getting picked instead of, and maybe even replacing, some Babylonian officials who were a little higher on the food chain than them. Make sense? So there might be a little bit of professional jealousy at the root of what we hear at the start of Daniel chapter 3. Let's jump over a couple of chapters. Now King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the other provisional officials to come to the dedication of this image that he set up. So the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the other provisional officials assembled at the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. So stylistically, Jewish literature from this time really likes repeated lists. So just settle in. We're going to meet those guys, and seems like it'd be really easy for them to go, yeah, all the same guys, not going to do that. We're going to list them every time, so just settle in. All right? So verse 4, then the herald loudly proclaimed, this is what you're commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear, here's another list, the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, pipes, and all other kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, and all the kinds of music, all the people fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and all the kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. Now there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. There's that professional jealousy rearing its ugly head. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to him, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and all kinds of music, if you're ready to fall down and worship in the image I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? All right, let's recap this real quick. So Nebuchadnezzar sets up this statue. Maybe a statue of a god. Most likely it seems to be a statue of Nebuchadnezzar himself. And he has a flair for the dramatic, so the statue is 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, and made of gold. Now, when he sets this up, the idea is that whenever the music plays, everyone is to bow down and worship this statue, offering their highest allegiance to Babylon and to Nebuchadnezzar as king. So in this story, Daniel's absent. We don't know where he is. Tradition says that he was somewhere else in the empire on the king's business, and so he's not there for this day. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are front and center. And they refuse to bow down to this statue. And so the Babylonian officials, that big long list of guys, right, who remember they're the guys at the office who are still mad they didn't get the promotion with the corner office and the window. And so they're like, here's our chance. So they go to Nebuchadnezzar and they're like, look, you told us what we're supposed to do, and we think it's a great idea, by the way. We love it. But there's these other dudes, and they just don't. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they won't bow down. They won't worship. And, I'm just trying to look out for you, Nebuchadnezzar, because you said whoever doesn't do that is going to be thrown into a blazing furnace. So I don't know, I just wanted to bring it to your attention. You do with it what you will, right? And so we're set up with this challenge, this interesting plot twist all of a sudden. And we might go, okay, this seems a little far-fetched, right? Okay, like I get it, the king might be mad, he might issue a decree, but a blazing furnace seems a little over the top. Seems like the kind of thing that you add to a story for some dramatic flair. But in chapter 2, there was this whole deal with Nebuchadnezzar having a dream about a different statue. Okay, and in this dream, the statue was made up of a bunch of different materials. And nobody, none of his wise men, none of his astrologers could interpret the dream. Eventually, only Daniel himself is able to interpret the dream. And Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, this statue represents all of these other kingdoms. Each of the different materials is a kingdom that will rise and fall, and they will all be laid waste before the one true king that God will eventually send. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, forget a statue made up of a bunch of different kinds of materials. I want mine all gold, top to bottom. Tradition even tells us that the gold he used to form this statue was some of the gold taken from the treasury in the temple in Jerusalem, the sacred articles that had been dedicated to the worship of Yahweh God, the one true God of Israel, have been repurposed, melted down, and put into this statue. Okay, so maybe we get it. He made the statue. But the furnace thing, right, that's got to be an exaggeration, right? No king is that crazy. Check out Nebuchadnezzar's reaction when his astrologers couldn't interpret the dream. Let's back up to chapter 2 for just a second here. Verse 5, the king replied to the astrologers, this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream means and what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. Verse 10, the astrologers answered the king, there is no man on earth who can do what the king asked. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician, enchanter, or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put to death the wise men, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. Okay, so overreacting seems to be right in Nebuchadnezzar's wheelhouse, right? It's very on brand for him. The prophet Jeremiah, who's an older contemporary of Daniel, tells us about the king burning alive a couple of people who he disagreed with the prophetic word they were speaking. Okay, so again, this seems very on brand for Nebuchadnezzar. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of these teenage boys who have been captured, who have been uprooted from their homes, from their families, taken miles and miles away, given new names, and forced into the service of a foreign king, who's known, by the way, to have a short fuse and isn't shy about dismembering or burning alive people he gets mad at. And now, they have been outed for refusing to bow down and worship the statue Nebuchadnezzar has made. And the penalty is a one-way trip to the burning furnace. Do you think it is safe for us to say this situation probably scared them just a little bit? And is it safe to say that some of what scared them was rooted in the traumas that they had already experienced and endured, the traumas that had already scarred them? And if we have scars, we can begin to relate. Because what scarred you then will often scare you now. What scarred you then will often scare you now, right? Our scars are the present reality of our past experience. And so what scarred you then will often scare you now. Right? You've tried and you've failed. You trusted someone and they hurt you. You went out on a limb and you got hung out to dry. What scarred you then will often scare you now. But the whole thing we're after in this conversation is to ask whether pursuing the ways and words of Jesus can begin to bring healing to our scars. So let's check out the response of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the king in Daniel chapter 3, verse 16. Let's pick it back up where we left off. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in the army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. And the king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. And King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." And he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was their hair on their heads singed, and their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. It's worth noting here what these young men say and what they don't say to the king. Right? They don't say, "Nebuchadnezzar, our God is bigger than you, our God is stronger than you, and there is nothing you can do to hurt us." They don't say that. What they say is, "Nebuchadnezzar, our God is big enough to save us. He is strong enough to save us. And even if you do the worst that you can do to us, we will not disobey our God and bow down to you." And it's important for us to understand what they don't say, because sometimes, guys, in real life, we get this twisted. Right? We either think that doing the right thing means we're never going to face situations that scare us. The moments that have the potential to scar us. Or we start to think that when we do face those moments, we're guaranteed to be okay because God is on our side. Faith doesn't work like that. Faith doesn't mean you never get scared. But trusting God can mean that what scares you doesn't have to scar you. Trusting God, putting your faith in who He is, who He says He is, what He has done, can mean that what scares you doesn't have to scar you. Right? Their faith didn't keep them out of the fire. If anything, it was their faith that put them in the fire. And you can't convince me that as they're being bound up, as they're being led to the platform at 15 years old to be burned alive, as they watch their captors die from the heat of the fire, that these kids were not scared. But what does the text say? When they came out of the fire, all the Babylonian cronies gathered around them. and they saw that the fire had not harmed them. Not a single hair on their head was singed, and their clothes didn't even smell like smoke. Faith doesn't mean you won't ever get scared, but trusting God for who He is can mean that what scares you doesn't have to scar you. That's not the best part, though. The best part is, why did they come through the fire? It wasn't their faith. Right? It wasn't their willingness to die for their faith. It was because when Nebuchadnezzar looked into the fire, he expected to see 3 bound young men burning to death. And instead, he saw 4 men walking unbound in the midst of the flames. One ancient tradition even includes the detail that Nebuchadnezzar went to look into the furnace because he thought he heard them singing. And it was this 4th man who was like a son of the gods. It's a term that can be hard for us to pin down in the Old Testament because it kind of gets used a few different ways, and it rarely means Jesus the way that we want it to in the New Testament, right? But this term, a son of the gods, throughout the Old Testament, at worst it means an angel, a divine being. But I think there's reason enough here in the text to believe this unnamed figure that Nebuchadnezzar sees walking unbound with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is the pre-incarnate Son of God. So let's look at how the chapter ends. Verse 28. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent this angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their house be turned into a pile of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So the king declares for all to hear that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be given every honor, and that anyone refusing to do so will be torn to pieces and their houses reduced to rubble. So I think it's safe to say Nebuchadnezzar didn't find Jesus in this moment because he still seems pretty crazy and ready to go off at a moment's notice. But the outcome of this entirety of the story tells us something significant for when we find ourselves scared in the present by the scars that we carry from the past. Surviving the scare changes the story your scars can tell. When we come into these moments where what has scared us, based on our past experiences, based on the traumas that we carry, the scars that we have, surviving the scare changes the story that your scars can tell. For these 3 young men, the story is no longer about a story about the trauma of warfare. Their story is no longer about being captured and uprooted from their homes and their families, having their names and identities taken from them. The story was no longer about the fear of a king who would rip them to shreds or burn them alive. The story is now the story of a God who saves, and a faith that allowed them to do the right thing even if he didn't. Yes, so many times we run from the moments in life that scare us, because the last time we faced those fears, they scarred us. Nobody likes being wounded. Nobody likes enduring trauma. And in a broken world, we all will have scars. Every scar tells a story. So what will yours say? Will your scars tell a story of unending hurt or of a God who can bring healing? What scarred you then doesn't have to scare you now. Hold fast to faith. Survive the scare. And allow God to begin rewriting the story of your scars. Let me pray for us.